Table of Contents. Title page. Table of Contents. Copyright. Introduction. Inventing the Enemy. Absolute and Relative. The Beauty of the Flame. Treasure Hunting. Fermented Delights. No Embryos in Paradise. Hugo, Ellis. The Poetics of Excess. Censorship and Silence. Imaginary Astronomies. Living by Proverbs. I Am Edmond Dantes. Ulysses. That's All We Needed. Why the Island Is Never Found. Thoughts on WikiLeaks. Footnotes. First American edition. Copyright 2011 by RCS Libri S.P.A. English translation Copyright 2012 by Richard Dixon. All rights reserved. For information about permission to reproduce selections from this book, write to Permissions, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt Publishing Company, 215 Park Avenue South, New York, 10003. hmhbooks.com. Library of Congress Cataloging and Publication Data. Eco, Umberto. Costruire il nemico e altri scritti occasionali. English. Inventing the Enemy and Other Occasional Writings, Umberto Eco, First American ed. P. C.M. ISBN 978-0-547-640-976. I. Title. PQ 4865. C6C5713-2012. 854 feet.914, DC 23. 2,012,014,407. Printed in the United States of America. Doc 109876654321. EISBN 978-0-547-57760-9. Verses 1.0912. Excerpts from 1984 by George Orwell. Copyright George Orwell, 1949. Are reprinted by permission of Bill Hamilton as the literary executor of the estate of the late Sonia Brownell Orwell and Secker and Warburg Limited. Illustration credits. Page 150. Series of Observations of the Planet Saturn, 1656, Oxford, Science Archive. Copyright 2011 Photo Scala Firenze, Heritage Images, Italian text page 238. Pages 210 to 211. Bougainville, Louis Antoine de, 1729 to 1811. Développement de la route fait autour du monde par les vaisseaux du royal abodes et l'étoile. Copyright BNF. Italian text pp. 318 to 319. Introduction. The title of this collection ought to have been the subtitle, Occasional Writings. It was only my publisher's proper concern that such a pompously modest title might not attract the reader's attention, whereas the title of the first essay may arouse curiosity, that determined the final choice. What are occasional writings and what are their virtues? They are generally on topics about which the author had no specific interest. He was, instead, encouraged to write each one after being invited to contribute to a series of discussions or essays on a particular theme. It captured the author's interest and encouraged him to reflect on something he might otherwise have ignored, and often a subject imposed from outside turns out to be more fruitful than one arising from some inner whim. Another virtue of occasional writing is that it does not demand originality at all costs, but aims to entertain the speaker as well as the listener. In short, occasional writing is an exercise in Baroque rhetoric, as when Roxane sets challenges for Christian, and through him, for Cyrano, such as, "Speak to me of love." At the end of each essay, all written over the past decade, I note the date and occasion. To emphasize their occasional nature, I should mention that Absolute and Relative and The Beauty of the Flame were presented during the Milanesiana Festival of Literature, an event centered on a specific theme. It provided an interesting opportunity to talk about the absolute at a time when the controversy over relativism was blowing up, though the second essay was quite a challenge, as I had never before felt, shall we say, fired by such a topic. No Embryos in Paradise is based on a lecture I gave in 2008 in Bologna at a conference on the ethics of research, which was then included in a book titled Etica della ricerca medica e identità culturale europea, edited by Francesco Gallifaro, Bologna, CLUEB, 2009. Thoughts on the Poetics of Excess in Victor Hugo bring together 3 different essays and lectures. I brazenly presented my entertainment called Imaginary Astronomies in 2 different versions at 2 different conferences, one on astronomy and the other on geography. Treasure Hunting gathers various contributions on cathedral treasuries. Fermented Delights was presented during a conference on Piero Camporesi. Censorship and Silence was delivered almost off the cuff at the conference of the Italian Semiotics Association in 2009. 3 essays appeared in 3 different issues of the Almanacco del Bibliofilo in 3 different years, and are pieces of real entertainment, inspired by 3 set themes. In Search of New Utopian Islands was the theme for Living by Proverbs, sentimental digressions on readings from earlier times, for I Am Edmond Dantes, and Late Reviews for Ulysses. That's All We Needed. The penultimate essay, Why the Island Is Never Found, appeared in the 2011 issue of the Almanacco del Bibliofilo and is the text of a lecture given on islands at a conference in Sardinia in 2010. Thoughts on WikiLeaks is the reworking of 2 articles, one that appeared in Liberacion, December 2, 2010, and the other in L'Espresso, December 31, 2010. Finally, returning to the first essay, Inventing the Enemy, was delivered as one of a series of lectures on the classics organized at the University of Bologna by Ivano Dionigi. These few pages seem rather scant, now that Gian Antonio Stella has so splendidly developed the whole question over more than 300 pages in his book Negri, Froci, Giude and Company. Later na guerra contro l'altro, Milan. Rizzoli, 2009, but never mind. It would have been a shame to let it sink into oblivion, seeing that making enemies is a continual and relentless occupation. Inventing the enemy. Some years ago in New York I found myself in conversation with a taxi driver whose name I had difficulty in placing. He explained, Pakistani and asked where I came from. Italy, I replied. He asked how many of us there were and was surprised we were so few and that our language wasn't English. Then he asked me who our enemies were. In response to my, sorry, he explained patiently that he wanted to know who were the people against whom we have fought through the centuries over land claims, ethnic rivalry, border incursions, and so forth. I told him we are not at war with anyone. He explained that he wanted to know who were our historical enemies, those who kill us and whom we kill. I repeated that we don't have any, that we fought our last war more than half a century ago, starting, moreover, with one enemy and ending with another. He wasn't satisfied. How can a country have no enemies? Getting out of the taxi, I left a $2 tip to compensate him for our indolent Italian pacifism. And only then did it occur to me how I should have answered. It is not true that we Italians have no enemies. We have no outside enemies, or rather we are unable to agree on who they are, because we are continually at war with each other. Pisa against Lucca, Guelphs against Ghibellines, North against South, fascists against partisans, mafia against state, Berlusconi's government against the judiciary. It was a pity that during that time the two governments headed by Romano Prodi had not yet fallen, otherwise I could have explained to the taxi driver what it means to lose a war through friendly fire. Thinking further about the conversation, I have come to the conclusion that one of Italy's misfortunes over the past 60 years has been the absence of real enemies. The unification of Italy took place thanks to the presence of Austria or, in the words of Giovanni Berchet, of the Irto, Increscioso Alamano, the bristling, irksome Teuton. And Mussolini was able to enjoy popular support by calling on Italy to avenge herself for a victory in tatters, for humiliating defeats in Abyssinia, Dogali and Adua, and for the Jewish Pluto-democracy, which, he claimed, was penalizing us iniquitously. See what happened in the United States when the evil empire vanished and the great Soviet enemy faded away. The United States was in danger of losing its identity until bin Laden, in gratitude for the benefits received when he was fighting against the Soviet Union, proffered his merciful hand and gave Bush the opportunity to create new enemies, strengthening feelings of national identity as well as his own power. Having an enemy is important not only to define our identity but also to provide us with an obstacle against which to measure our system of values and, in seeking to overcome it, to demonstrate our own worth. So when there is no enemy, we have to invent one. Look at the generous flexibility with which the skinheads of Verona would, just to identify themselves as a group, choose anyone not belonging to their group as their enemy. And so we are concerned here not so much with the almost natural phenomenon of identifying an enemy who is threatening us, but with the process of creating and demonizing the enemy. In the orations against Catiline, Cicero had no need to convince the Roman senators that they had an enemy since he had proof of Lucius Catiline's plot. But nonetheless he builds up a picture of the enemy in the second oration, where he describes Catiline's friends, reflecting on the main accusation, that they were tainted with moral perversity. Individuals who spend their time feasting, in the arms of loose women, torpid with wine, sated with food, crowned with wreaths, oiled with unguents, weakened by copulation, belch out in words that all good citizens must be killed and the city must be set on fire. You have them under your very eyes, not a hair out of place, smooth-faced or with a well-trimmed beard, dressed in tunics down to their ankles and with long sleeves, wrapped in veils and not togas. These youths, so witty and refined, have learned not only to love and be loved, not only to dance and sing, but also to brandish daggers and administer poisons. Oration 2, sections 1 to 10. Cicero's moralism was much the same as St. Augustine's, who condemned pagans because, unlike Christians, they attended circuses, theaters, and amphitheaters and celebrated orgiastic feasts. Enemies are different from us and observe customs that are not our own. The epitome of difference is the foreigner. In Roman bas-reliefs the barbarians appear as bearded and snub-nosed, and as is well known, the word itself alludes to a defect in language and therefore in thought. Barbar, they are stuttering. From the very beginning, however, the people who become our enemies often are not those who directly threaten us, as would have been the case with the barbarians, but those whom someone has an interest in portraying as a true threat even when they aren't. Rather than a real threat highlighting the ways in which these enemies are different from us, the difference itself becomes a symbol of what we find threatening. See what Tacitus has to say about the Jews. All things that are sacred for us are profane for them, and what is impure for us is lawful for them. Which brings to mind how the English dismiss the French as frog-eaters or how the Germans condemn the Italians for excessive use of garlic. The Jews are strange, because they abstain from eating pork, do not put yeast in bread, rest on the seventh day, marry only among themselves, are circumcised, not, of course, for hygienic or religious reasons but to show they are different from others, bury their dead, and do not venerate our Caesars. Having demonstrated how certain real customs are different, circumcision, Sabbath rest, the writer can further emphasize his point by adding legendary customs to the picture. They make sacred images of a donkey and despise their parents, children, brothers, their country, and the gods. Pliny the Younger can find no particular allegations against the Christians, since he has to admit they are not involved in committing crimes. In fact, their actions are virtuous. Nonetheless, he sends them to their death because they do not sacrifice to the emperor, and this stubbornness in refusing something so obvious and natural establishes their difference. Then, as contact between peoples becomes more complex, a new form of enemy arises. He is not just the person who remains outside and exhibits his strangeness from a distance, but is also the person within, among us. Today we would call him the foreign immigrant, who behaves differently in some way or speaks our language badly. He appears in Juvenal's satire as the cunning, swindling, brazen, lecherous Greek, capable of debauching even his friend's grandmother. The Negro, due to the color of his skin, is a stranger wherever he goes. The entry for Negro in the first American Encyclopedia, published by Thomas Dobson in 1798, states, "In the complexion of Negroes we meet with various shades, but they likewise differ far from other men in all the features of their face. Round cheeks, high cheekbones, a forehead somewhat elevated, a short, broad, flat nose, thick lips, small ears, ugliness, and irregularity of shape, characterize their external appearance. The Negro women have the loins greatly depressed, and very large buttocks, which gives the back the shape of a saddle. Vices the most notorious seem to be the portion of this unhappy race. Idleness, treachery, revenge, cruelty, impudence, stealing, lying, profanity, debauchery, nastiness, and intemperance, are said to have extinguished the principles of natural law, and to have silenced the reproofs of conscience. They are strangers to every sentiment of compassion, and are an awful example of the corruption of man when left to himself. The Negro is ugly. The enemy must be ugly because beauty is identified with good, collocagothia, and one of the fundamental characteristics of beauty has always been what the Middle Ages called integritas, in other words, having all that is required to be an average representative of a species. By this standard those humans missing a limb or an eye, or having lower than average stature, inhuman, color were considered ugly. That is why the giant one-eyed Polyphemus and the dwarf mime immediately provide us with a model for identifying the enemy. Priscus of Panion in the 5th century describes Attila the Hun as small in stature, with a broad chest and large head, small eyes, a thin graying beard, a flat nose, and, a crucial feature, a swarthy complexion. But it is curious how Attila's face is similar to the physiognomy of the devil, as Rodolphus Glaber described him more than 5 centuries later: gaunt face, deep black eyes, forehead furrowed with wrinkles, flat nose, protruding mouth, swollen lips, thin narrow chin, goatish beard, hairy pointed ears, straight disheveled hair, canine teeth, elongated skull. He was also of modest stature, with a slender neck, protruding chest, and humped back. Histories, Book 5, Part 3. When Liutprand of Cremona is sent by Emperor Otto I as envoy to Byzantium in 968 and encounters a hitherto unknown civilization, he finds the Byzantine emperor devoid of integritas. I came before Nicephorus, a monstrous being, a pygmy with an enormous head, whose small eyes gave him the appearance of a mole, with an ugly short broad thick graying beard, a neck as long as a finger. The color of an Ethiopian, whom you wouldn't want to bump into in the middle of the night, fat belly, thin loins, thighs too long for his small stature, short legs, flat feet, and dressed in a fetid, threadbare peasant's garment faded with use. Relatio de Legatione Constantinopolitana. Fetid. The enemy invariably stinks, as the French psychologist Edgar Barillon wrote at the beginning of the First World War, 1915, in La Polychésie de la race allemande. In this volume he demonstrated that the average German produced more, and fouler smelling, fecal material than did the Frenchman. If the Byzantine stank, so too did the Saracen. In Avagatorium in Terrae Sanctae, Arabiae, et Egypti Peregrinationum, the 15th century monk Felix Fabry notes that the Saracens exude a certain horrible stench, for which they perform continual ablutions of various sorts, and since we do not smell, they do not care if we bathe together with them. But they are not so indulgent with the Jews, who smell even more. Thus the stinking Saracens are pleased to find themselves in the company of those like us who do not smell. For Giuseppe Giusti, it was the Austrians who stank. Arriving at the Basilica of Sant'Ambrogio in Milan, he recorded these impressions. I enter, and find it full of soldiers. Those soldiers from the north. Bohemians and Croatians. Lined up like poles in a vineyard. I drew back, since standing there, amid that rabble, I must admit, a feeling of disgust, of suffocation, of filthy breath, which, by your calling, you can scarcely feel, even the candles. Excuse me, your excellency. On the altar of that fine house of God, seemed to reek of tallow. Sant'Ambrogio, 1845. The gypsy inevitably stinks, given that he feeds on carrion, as Cesare Lombroso tells us in L'Uomo Delinquente, 1876, Volume 1, Chapter 2. And so does James Bond's enemy Rosa Klebb in Ian Fleming's From Russia, with Love, 1957. She is not only a Soviet Russian but, worse still, a lesbian. Outside the anonymous, cream-painted door, Tatiana already smelled the inside of the room. When the voice told her curtly to come in, and she opened the door, it was the smell that filled her mind while she stood and stared into the eyes of the woman who sat behind the round table under the center light. It was the smell of the metro on a hot evening, cheap scent concealing animal odors. People in Russia soak themselves in scent, whether they have had a bath or not, but mostly when they have not. Tatiana was still cheerfully reviewing the situation when the bedroom door opened and the clubwoman appeared, wearing a semi-transparent nightgown in orange crepe de chine. One dimpled knee, like a yellowish coconut, appeared thrust forward between the half-open folds of the nightgown in the classic stance of the modeler. Rosa Klebb had taken off her spectacles and her naked face was now thick with mascara and rouge and lipstick. She patted the couch beside her. "Turn out the top light, my dear. The switch is by the door. Then come and sit beside me. We must get to know each other better." Chapter 9. The Jew has been described as monstrous and smelly since at least the birth of Christianity, given that he is modeled on the Antichrist, the archenemy, the foe not only of man but of God. This is how he looks. His head is like a burning flame, his right eye is bloodshot, his left is a cat-like green and has 2 pupils, his eyelids are white, his lower lip is large, his right femur is weak, his feet large, his thumb flat and elongated. Syriac Testament of our Lord Jesus Christ, 5th century, Volume 1, Part 4. The Antichrist will be born from the Jewish people, from the union between a father and a mother, like other men, and not, as some say, from a virgin. At the beginning of his conception the devil will enter the mother's uterus, by virtue of the devil he will be nurtured in the mother's womb, and the power of the devil will always be with him. Adza of Montier and Der, Letter on the Origin and Time of the Antichrist, 10th century. He will have 2 flaming eyes, ears like those of a donkey, the nose and mouth of a lion, so that he will set men to acts of most criminal folly amid the fires and most shameful voices of contradiction, making them deny God, spreading into their senses the most horrible fedor, mutilating the institutions of the church with the most ferocious greed, sneering with an enormous grimace and showing horrible teeth of iron. Hildegard of Bingen, Liber Scivias, 12th century, Volume 3, Part 1, Section 14. If the Antichrist comes from the Jewish people, his model must inevitably reflect the image of the Jew, whether in terms of popular antisemitism, theological antisemitism, or the bourgeois antisemitism of the 18th and 19th centuries. Let us start with his face. They generally have a bluish face, hooked nose, deep-set eyes, protruding chin, and strongly pronounced constrictor muscles around the lips. Jews are also prone to diseases which indicate a corruption of the blood, such as leprosy in the past and now scurvy, which is akin to it, scrofula, bleeding. It is said that Jews always have bad breath. Others attribute these effects to the frequent use of strong-smelling vegetables such as onion and garlic. Yet others say it is goose meat, to which they are very partial, that makes them dark and melancholic, given that this food is thickly coated with sticky sugar. Baptiste-Henri Grégoire, Essai sur la régénération physique, morale, et politique des Juifs, 1788. Later, the composer Richard Wagner was to complicate the picture with his considerations of voice and manner. There is something foreign about the outward aspect of the Jew that makes this nationality supremely repugnant. Instinctively we wish to have nothing in common with a man who looks like that. It is impossible to imagine the representation of an antique or modern stage character by a Jew, be it as hero or lover, without feeling instinctively that there is something incongruous, indeed ridiculous, in such a performance. But what repels us above all else is the particular tone with which the Jew speaks. Our ears are particularly offended by the shrill, sibilant, strident sounds of this idiom. The Jew uses words and constructs his phrases in a way quite contrary to the spirit of our national language. When we listen to him, our attention dwells involuntarily on how he speaks rather than on what he says. This point is of the greatest importance in explaining the expression produced by the musical works of the Jews. Listening to a Jew talking, we are inevitably offended by the fact of finding his discourse devoid of all truly human expression. It is natural that the inherent aridness of the Jewish character which we find so distasteful finds its greatest expression in song, which is the liveliest, most authentic manifestation of individual feeling. We might recognize the Jew's artistic aptitude for any other art except that of song, which nature herself seems to have denied him. Judaism in Music, 1850. Hitler proceeds with a greater delicacy, bordering almost on envy. In regard to young people, clothes should take their place in the service of education. If the beauty of the body were not completely forced into the background today through our stupid manner of dressing, it would not be possible for thousands of our girls to be led astray by Jewish mongrels, with their repulsive crooked waddle. Mein Kampf, 1925, translated by James Murphy. From facial appearance to customs. This brings us to the Jewish enemy who kills young children and drinks their blood. He appears very early, for example, in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where there is a story, much like that of Saint Simonino of Trento, of a young boy seized while passing through the Jewish quarter while singing, O Alma Redemptoris Mater. His throat is slashed and his body thrown into a pit. The Jew who kills young children and drinks their blood has a very complex genealogy. The same model existed earlier in Christianity, in the creation of the enemy within, the heretic. A single example is enough. In the evening, when we light the lamps and commemorate the Passion, they take young girls initiated into their secret rites to a particular house, They snuff out their lamps as they wish no one to witness the indecencies about to take place, and give vent to their licentious practices on whomever it might be, even upon sister or daughter. Indeed, they believe they are pleasing the demons by violating the divine laws that forbid union with those of the same blood. Once the ritual is over, they return home and wait for 9 months to pass. When the time comes for the godless children to be born of a godless seed, they assemble once again in the same place. 3 days after the birth, they seize the wretched children from their mothers, cut their tender limbs with a sharp blade, fill cups with the blood that spurts forth, burn the newborns while they are still breathing by throwing them on a pyre. Then they mix blood and ash in cups to obtain a horrible concoction with which they contaminate food and drink, secretly, like someone poisoning mead. Such is their communion. Michel Pacello, De Operatione Demonum, 11th century. The enemy is sometimes seen as different and ugly because he belongs to a lower class. In the Iliad, Thersites, crooked, lame in one foot, his shoulders rounded and bent over his chest, his head pointed and sprouting tufts of hair, Book 2, line 212, is socially inferior to Agamemnon and Achilles, and is therefore jealous of them. There is little difference between Thersites and Edmondo de Amicis' character Frandy in his novel Quor, Heart, 1886. Whereas Odysseus attacks Thersites, drawing blood, society punishes Frandy with imprisonment. The 25th of October, and beside him there's a tough, cheeky-looking fellow called Frandy who has already been expelled from another school. 21. January, only one boy could laugh while Derossi was talking about the king's funeral, and that was Frandy. I hate him. He's evil. When a father comes to school to reprimand his son, Frandy thinks it's funny. When a boy cries, he laughs. He's frightened of Garone, and thumps the builder's son because he's small. He torments Crossy as his arm is paralyzed. He taunts Precocy, whom everyone likes. He even pokes fun at Robetti, in the second year, who walks on crutches after having saved a young child. He goads everyone who's weaker than him, and when it comes to blows, he gets vicious and hurts people. There's something repulsive about that low forehead, those dark eyes, which he keeps half hidden beneath the peak of his waxed cotton cap. He fears nothing, laughs in the teacher's face, steals when he can, lies brazenly, is always arguing with someone, brings large pins to school to prick his classmates, he rips buttons off his jacket and off those of other boys, and plays with them, and his school bag, exercise books, textbooks are all crumpled, torn, dirty, his ruler dented, his pen chewed, his nails raw, his clothes creased and torn from fighting. The teacher sometimes pretends not to see his mischief, and that makes him worse. When he tried to treat him kindly, he insulted him. When he scolded him, he covered his face with his hands, as if he were crying, and he was laughing. The born criminal and the prostitute are obvious examples of ugliness, due to their social position. But with the prostitute we enter another world, that of sexual enmity or what might be called sexual racism. For the male who dominates and writes, or by writing dominates, the woman has always been portrayed with hostility from the earliest times. Let us not be deceived by angelic descriptions of women. On the contrary, precisely because great literature is dominated by sweet, gentle creatures, the world of satire, which is that of the popular imagination, continually demonizes the woman, from antiquity, through the Middle Ages, and up to modern times. From antiquity, I will limit myself to one example from Martial. You, Vetustia, who have outlived 300 consuls. You have but 3 hairs and 4 teeth and have the chest of a grasshopper, the legs and color of an ant. You walk about with a forehead more wrinkled than your gown and breasts like cobwebs. Your eyesight is like that of owls in the morning and you smell like he-goats. Your buttocks are like those of a withered duck's bottom. Only the funeral torch can penetrate this vagina. Epigrams, Book 3, number 93. And who could be the author of this passage? The female is an imperfect animal, stirred by 1,000 passions that are disagreeable and loathsome even to think about, let alone to discuss. No other animal is less clean than she. Not even the pig, wallowing in mud, is as ugly as they are, and if anyone should wish to deny this, let him examine their parts, let him search out the secret places where, in shame, they hide the fearful instruments with which they remove their superfluous humors. If someone as irreligious in body as Giovanni Boccaccio, in The Crow, could think such a thing, then imagine what a medieval moralist must have thought and written to emphasize the Pauline principle that, if such temptation could be avoided, it would be better never to experience the pleasures of the flesh. The churchman Odo of Cluny recalled in the 10th century that, the beauty of the body is only skin deep. If men could see beneath the flesh, with the power of the Boeotian lynx to penetrate visually within, they would be nauseated just to look at women, for all this feminine charm is nothing but phlegm, blood, humors, gall. Consider what is hidden in the nostrils, in the throat, in the stomach. Everywhere, filth. And we are repelled to touch vomit and ordure even with our fingertips. How then can we ever want to embrace what is merely a sack of excrement? Collationes, Book 3, Chapter 133, Call 556 and 648. From what might be called this, normal misogyny, we come to the creation of the witch, a masterpiece of modern civilization. The witch was certainly also known in classical antiquity, and I will mention only the witches in Apuleius's Golden Ass and in Horace. I myself saw Candia, wrapped in a black gown, barefooted and hair disheveled, howling with the elder Sagana. Pallor had rendered both of them horrible to behold. Satires, Book 1, number 8. But in antiquity, as in the Middle Ages, witches and wizards were generally linked to popular beliefs and were thought to represent fairly infrequent instances of possession. Rome at the time of Horace did not feel threatened by witches, and witchcraft in the Middle Ages was still regarded as a phenomenon of autosuggestion. In other words, the witch was someone who believed she was a witch, as the 9th century canon Episcopi stated. Certain depraved women, having turned to Satan and been led astray by his illusions and seductions, believe and claim they have ridden certain beasts at night, in the company of a multitude of women, following Diana. Priests must constantly preach to God's people that these things are all raised in the minds of the faithful not by the divine spirit but by the force of evil. Satan, in fact, is transformed into an angel of light and takes possession of the mind of these poor women and rules over them due to their lack of faith and their incredulity. And yet, at the dawn of the modern age, witches were said to meet in sects, to celebrate their Sabbaths, to fly, to transform themselves into animals, and thus become the enemies of society, and as such to merit inquisitorial trials and death at the stake. This is not the place for examining the complex problem of the witchcraft syndrome, whether it represented a way of finding a scapegoat at a time of profound social crisis or the influence of Siberian shamanism or the phenomenon of eternal archetypes. What interests us here is the recurring model for the creation of an enemy, similar to the treatment of the heretic or the Jew. And it is not enough for men of science, such as Girolamo Cardano in the 16th century, to raise their sensible objections. They are poor women of miserable condition, who scrape a living in the valleys feeding on chestnuts and herbs. Thus they are emaciated, deformed, ashen in color, with protruding eyes, and their gaze reveals a melancholy and bilious temperament. They are taciturn, distracted, and hardly distinguishable from those who are possessed by the devil. They are so firm in their opinions that anyone listening to their stories alone would be quite sure the things they say with such conviction were true, things that have never happened and will never happen. De Rerum Veritate Book 15. A new wave of persecutions began in response to the spread of leprosy. Carlo Ginzburg, in his Ecstasies, Deciphering the Witch's Sabbath, 1991, translated by Raymond Rosenthal, records that lepers were burned to death throughout France in 1321 because they had been convicted of trying to kill the whole population by poisoning water supplies, fountains, and wells. Leprous women who had confessed to the crime spontaneously, or as a result of torture, were to be burnt, unless pregnant. In that eventuality, they must be kept segregated until their confinement and the weaning of their offspring, and then burnt. It is not difficult to identify here the origins of every persecution of those thought to be spreading plague. But Ginzburg describes yet another aspect of this phenomenon. The contagious lepers were automatically identified with Jews and Saracens. Various chroniclers relate stories that accuse the Jews of aiding and abetting the lepers, and many of them were sent to the stake with the afflicted. The local population took justice into their own hands, summoning neither priest nor bailiff. They closed the people in their homes, together with their livestock, goods, and chattels, and set fire to them. One leader of such a group confessed he had been bribed by a Jew, who had given him some poison, made with human blood, urine, 3 herbs, and pieces of the consecrated host, placed in a sack that was weighted so it would easily sink to the bottom of a drinking fountain. But, he said, it was the king of Granada who had gone to the Jews, and another source also added the Sultan of Babylon to the plot. 3 traditional enemies, the leper, the Jew, and the Saracen, were thus brought together in one fell swoop. Reference to the 4th enemy, the heretic, was provided in a detail. The assembled lepers had to spit on the host and trample on the cross. Rituals of this kind were later said to be practiced by witches. The 14th century saw the appearance of the first manuals for the trial of heretics by Inquisition, such as the Practica Inquisitionis Hereticae Pravitatis by Bernardo Guay and the Directorium Inquisitorum by Niccolao Emmerich, and in the 15th century, while Marsilio Ficino is translating Plato in Florence on the orders of Cosimo de' Medici and, according to a well-known schoolboy's ditty, people were preparing to sing, at last, the Middle Ages are past. John Nider's Formicarius, written between 1435 and 1437 and published in 1473, speaks for the first time in a modern vein about the various practices of witchcraft. Innocent VIII wrote about these practices in the papal bull Summus Desiderantes Effectibus of 1484. It has recently reached our ears, to our great distress, that in certain regions of Germany, persons of both sexes, heedless of their own well-being and straying from the Catholic faith, have no hesitation in giving themselves carnally to devils incubus and succubus, letting the progeny of women, animals, fruits of the earth, die or perish, by means of spells, charms, incantations, and other odious magical practices. Seeking, as our office requires of us, by way of appropriate remedies, to prevent the scourge of heretical depravity from spreading its poison to the detriment of innocent people, the aforementioned Inquisitors Sprenger and Kramer are permitted to exercise the inquisitorial office in those lands. And Sprenger and Kramer, inspired also by the Formicarius, published their infamous Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of the Witches, in 1486. The records of the Inquisition in 1477 against Antonia, of the parish of St. Georgios in the Diocese of Geneva, provide one of 1,000 examples of how a witch was created. The accused, having abandoned her husband, went with Masset to the place known as Las Peroi, near the stream, where a synagogue of heretics was held, and found there a large number of men and women, who courted, capered, and danced backwards with her. He then showed her a demon called Rabané, who had the appearance of a Negro, saying, "Here is our master, to whom we must pay homage if you wish to have all you desire." The defendant asked him what she had to do, and the said Masad replied, "Disown God your Creator, and the Catholic faith and that adulteress the Virgin Mary, and accept this demon called Rabané as your Lord and Master, and do whatever he wishes of you." Having heard these words, the accused began to feel regretful and refused at first to comply. But she eventually disowned God her Creator, saying, "I disown God my Creator and the Catholic faith and the Holy Cross, and accept you, demon Rabané, as my Lord and Master." And she paid homage to the demon by kissing his foot. Then in contempt of God she threw a wooden cross to the ground, trampled it under her left foot, and broke it. She was transported on a staff 1.5 feet long. To reach the synagogues she had to lubricate it with the ointment contained in a pyx, which was filled with it, and place the staff between her thighs, saying, "Go, go to the devil," and she was immediately transported swiftly into the air to the place of the synagogue. She also confesses that in the aforesaid place they ate bread and meat, they drank wine and danced again, the said demon, their master, having then transformed himself from a man into a black dog, they honored and worshipped him, kissing him on the behind. Finally the demon, having doused the fire that was burning there with green flames illuminating the synagogue, exclaimed loudly, "Meklet! Meklet!" And upon that cry the men lay bestially with the women and she with the aforesaid Masad Garin. Quoted in La Civiltà della Streghe by Giuseppina and Eugenio Battisti, 1964. This testimony, with its various details about spitting on the cross and kissing the anus, is almost identical to the testimony given in the trial of the Knights Templar, which took place a century and a half before. What is surprising in this 15th century trial is that not only are the inquisitors guided in their lines of questioning by what they have read of the earlier trials, but also, at the end of the interrogation, which seemed fairly summary, the victim is herself convinced of the truth of the accusations made against her. At the witchcraft trials, not only is a picture built up of the enemy, and not only does the victim in the end also admit to doing what she hasn't done, but through the act of confessing she becomes convinced that what she is saying is true. You will remember how a similar procedure is described in Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, 1940, and how, during the trials under Stalin, a picture was first built up of the enemy and the victims were then persuaded to recognize themselves in that picture. Even those who might otherwise hope to be viewed in a favorable light are induced, in this way, to become the enemy. Theater and literature provide us with examples of the ugly duckling, who, having been scorned by his equals, adapts to the image they have of him. I will quote Shakespeare's Richard III as an example. "But I, that am not shapped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking glass. I, that am curtailed of this fair portion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time, into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable, that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why I have no delight to pass away the time, and less to spy my shadow in the sun, and descant my own deformity, and therefore, since I cannot prove a lover, to entertain these fair well-spoken days, I am determined to be a villain." Act 1, Scene 1. It seems we cannot manage without an enemy. The figure of the enemy cannot be abolished from the processes of civilization. The need is second nature even to a mild man of peace. In his case the image of the enemy is simply shifted from a human object to a natural or social force that in some way threatens us and has to be defeated, whether it be capitalistic exploitation, environmental pollution, or third world hunger. But though these are virtuous cases, even hatred of injustice, as Brecht reminds us, makes the brow grow stern. Is our moral sense therefore impotent when faced with the age-old need for enemies? I would argue that morality intervenes not when we pretend we have no enemies but when we try to understand them, to put ourselves in their situation. Aeschylus has no resentment toward the Persians, whose tragedy he experiences with them and from their point of view. Caesar treats the Gauls with great respect. At worst, he makes them appear rather wimpish each time they surrender. And Tacitus admires the Germans, crediting them with fine complexions and complaining only about their dirtiness and their reluctance to undertake heavy work as they cannot cope with heat and thirst. Trying to understand other people means destroying the stereotype without denying or ignoring the otherness. But let us be realistic. These ways of understanding the enemy are the prerogative of poets, saints, or traitors. Our innermost impulses are of quite another kind. In 1967, report from Iron Mountain on the possibility and desirability of peace was published in America by a certain John Doe. Someone even suggested it was Galbraith. Point 1. It was clearly a pamphlet against war, or at least a pessimistic lament on its inevitability. But since, in order to wage war, we need an enemy to fight, the inevitability of war is linked to the inevitability of identifying and creating an enemy. In the pamphlet it is thus suggested with extreme seriousness that the reconversion of the whole of American society to a state of peace would be disastrous, since only war provides the basis for the harmonious development of human societies. Its organized wastage provides a valve that regulates the effective running of society. It resolves the problem of supplies. It is a driving force. War enables a community to recognize itself as a nation. A government cannot even establish its own sphere of legitimacy without the contrasting presence of war. Only war ensures the equilibrium between classes and makes it possible to locate and exploit antisocial elements. Peace produces instability and delinquency among young people. War channels all disruptive forces in the best possible way, giving them a status. The army is the last hope for outcasts and misfits. The system of war alone, with its power over life and death, induces people to pay a blood price for institutions far less central to social organization than war, such as the motorcar. From the ecological point of view, war provides a release valve for surplus lives, and though, until the 19th century, only the most courageous members of society, soldiers, were killed in war while worthless members survived, current technology has made it possible to overcome this problem with the bombardment of urban centers. Bombardment limits the population boom better than ritual infanticide, monasticism, sexual mutilation, extensive use of capital punishment. War makes it possible, at last, to develop a truly humanistic art in which conflicted situations predominate. If this is so, the cultivation of the enemy must be intensive and continuous. George Orwell provides an excellent example of this in 1984, 1949. The next moment a hideous, grinding speech, as of some monstrous machine running without oil, burst from the big telescreen at the end of the room. It was a noise that set one's teeth on edge and bristled the hair at the back of one's neck. The hate had started. As usual, the face of Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, had flashed onto the screen. There were hisses here and there among the audience. The little sandy-haired woman gave a squeak of mingled fear and disgust. Goldstein was the renegade and backslider who once, long ago, had been one of the leading figures of the party. He was the primal traitor, the earliest defiler of the party's purity. All subsequent crimes against the party, all treacheries, acts of sabotage, heresies, deviations, sprang directly out of his teaching. Somewhere or other he was still alive and hatching his conspiracies. Winston's diaphragm was constricted. He could never see the face of Goldstein without a painful mixture of emotions. It was a lean Jewish face, with a great fuzzy aureole of white hair and a small goatee beard. A clever face, and yet somehow inherently despicable, with a kind of senile silliness in the long thin nose near the end of which a pair of spectacles was perched. It resembled the face of a sheep, and the voice, too, had a sheep-like quality. Goldstein was delivering his usual venomous attack upon the doctrines of the party. He was demanding the immediate conclusion of peace with Eurasia. He was advocating freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought. He was crying hysterically that the revolution had been betrayed. Before the hate had proceeded for 30 seconds, uncontrollable exclamations of rage were breaking out from half the people in the room. In its second minute the hate rose to a frenzy. People were leaping up and down in their places and shouting at the tops of their voices in an effort to drown the maddening bleating voice that came from the screen. The little sandy-haired woman had turned bright pink, and her mouth was opening and shutting like that of a landed fish. The dark-haired girl behind Winston had begun crying out, "Swine! Swine! Swine!" And suddenly she picked up a heavy Newspeak dictionary and flung it at the screen. It struck Goldstein's nose and bounced off. The voice continued inexorably. In a lucid moment Winston found that he was shouting with the others and kicking his heel violently against the rung of his chair. The horrible thing about the 2 minutes hate was not that one was obliged to act a part, but that it was impossible to avoid joining in. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash faces in with a sledgehammer, seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one even against one's will into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. Part 1, Chapter 1. We do not have to reach the excesses of 1984 to recognize ourselves as beings who need an enemy. We are witnessing the fear that can be caused by new influxes of migrants. In Italy today, Romanians are being portrayed as the enemy by extending to a whole ethnic culture the characteristics of a few of its marginalized members, thus providing an ideal scapegoat for a society that, caught up in change, including ethnic change, is no longer able to recognize itself. Sartre provides the most pessimistic vision in this respect in No Exit. We can recognize ourselves only in the presence of another, and on this the rules of coexistence and submission are based. But it is more likely that we find this other intolerable because to some degree he is not us. In this way, by reducing him to an enemy, we create our hell on earth. When Sartre locks up 3 people who have died, who didn't know each other in life, in a hotel bedroom, one of them realizes the terrible truth. Wait. You'll see how simple it is. Childishly simple. Obviously there aren't any physical torments. You agree, don't you? And yet, we're in hell. And no one else will come here. We'll stay in this room, the 3 of us, forever and ever. In short, there's someone absent here, the official torturer. It's obvious what they're after, an economy of manpower. Each of us will act as torturer of the 2 others, translated by Stuart Gilbert. Lecture given at Bologna University on May 15, 2008, as part of a series of evenings on the classics, published in Elogio della Politica, edited by Ivano Dianigi, Milan. BUR, 2009. Absolute and relative. If you are here this evening in spite of the terroristic title of my talk, that means you are prepared for anything, though a serious lecture about absolute and relative ought to last at least 2,500 years, as long as the debate itself. The title of this year's Milanesiana Festival is Conflict in the Absolute, and naturally I have been wondering what these words mean. It's the most basic question any philosopher must ask. Since I haven't been to the festival's other events, I did a search on the internet for pictures by artists who referred to the Absolute, and there I found Magritte's Le Connaissance Absolue, as well as various works by others I needn't name, Painting the Absolute, Quête d'Absolu, In Search of the Absolute, Marcher d'Absolu, and several advertisements like the one for Absolute Vodka. The Absolute, it seems, is selling well. The notion of absolute also brought to mind one of its opposites, namely, the notion of relative, which has become rather fashionable ever since leading churchmen, and even some secular thinkers, began a campaign against what they call relativism. It's a term that has become derogatory, used for almost terroristic ends, like Berlusconi's use of the word communism. But here I will limit myself to confounding your ideas rather than clarifying them, suggesting how each of these terms, depending on the circumstances, means many different things, and that they shouldn't be used as baseball bats. According to dictionaries on philosophy, absolute means anything that is absolutist, free from ties or limits, something that does not depend on something else, which has its own inherent reason, cause, and explanation. Something therefore very similar to God, in the sense that he describes himself as, I am who I am, ego sum qui sum, to which everything else is contingent and therefore does not have its own inherent cause and, even if it happens to exist, it could just as well not exist, or not exist tomorrow, as is the case with the solar system or with each one of us. As we are contingent beings, and therefore destined to die, we desperately need to think there is something to fasten onto that will not perish, in other words, an absolute. But this absolute can be transcendent, like the biblical divinity, or immanent. Without discussing Spinoza or Giordano Bruno, with the idealist philosophers we ourselves enter to become part of the absolute, since the absolute, for example, in Schelling, would be the indissoluble unity of the conscious being and of such things that were once considered extraneous to the individual, such as nature or the world. In the absolute we identify with God, we are part of something that is not yet fully complete, a process, a development, infinite growth, and infinite self-definition. But if this is how things are, we can never define or know the absolute since we are part of it, and trying to understand it would be like Baron Munchausen pulling himself out of the swamp by his own hair. The alternative, then, is to think of the absolute as something that we are not, and that is elsewhere, not dependent on us, like the God of Aristotle, who thinks of himself as thinking, and who, according to Joyce in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, remains within or behind or beyond or above his handiwork, invisible, refined out of existence, indifferent, paring his fingernails. Back in the 15th century, in fact, Nicholas of Cusa in Didacta Ignorantia wrote, Deus est absolutus. But since God is absolute, said Nicholas, he can never fully be reached. The relationship between our knowledge and God is the same as that between a polygon and the circumference into which it is drawn. As the sides of the polygon gradually increase, it comes closer and closer to the circumference, but the polygon and the circumference will never be the same. God, said Nicholas, is like a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. Is it possible to imagine a circle with its center everywhere and no circumference? Obviously not. And yet we can describe it, which is what I am doing now, and each of you understand that I'm talking about something to do with geometry, except that it is geometrically impossible and unimaginable. There is therefore a difference between whether or not we can imagine a thing and whether we can nevertheless name it, give it some meaning. What does it mean to use a word and give it a meaning? It means many things. A. To have instructions for recognizing such an object or situation or event. For example, the meaning of the word dog or stumble includes a series of descriptions, also in the form of images, for recognizing a dog and distinguishing it from a cat, and differentiating a stumble from a jump. B. To have a definition or classification. Definitions and classifications are given to a dog but also to events or situations such as voluntary manslaughter, as opposed to involuntary manslaughter. C. To know about other properties, facts, or encyclopedic details of a given entity. For example, I know that dogs are faithful and good for hunting or guarding. I know that a conviction for voluntary manslaughter can lead to a particular sentence of imprisonment, and so forth. D. Where possible, to have instructions on how to produce the corresponding object or event. I know what vase means since I know how vase is produced even though I am not a potter, and the same is true for terms like decapitation or sulfuric acid. Whereas for a word like brain, I know meanings A and B, and some of the properties in C, but I do not know how to produce one. A magnificent case in which I know properties A, B, C, and D is offered by C.S. Peirce, who defines lithium as follows. If you look into a textbook of chemistry for a definition of lithium, you may be told that it is that element whose atomic weight is 7 very nearly. But if the author has a more logical mind, he will tell you that if you search among minerals that are vitreous, translucent, gray or white, very hard, brittle and insoluble, for one which imparts a crimson tinge to an unluminous flame, this mineral being triturated with lime or witherite rat's bane, and then fused, can be partly dissolved in muriatic acid. And if this solution be evaporated and the residue be extracted with sulfuric acid, and duly purified, it can be converted by ordinary methods into a chloride, which being obtained in the solid state, fused, and electrolyzed with half a dozen powerful cells, will yield a globule of pinkish silvery metal that will float on gasoline. And the material of that is a specimen of lithium. The peculiarity of this definition, or rather this precept that is more serviceable than a definition, is that it tells you what the word lithium denotes by prescribing what you are to do in order to gain a perceptual acquaintance with the object of the word. Collected Papers, Volume 2, Paragraph 330. This is a good example of a complete and satisfactory representation of the meaning of a term. But other expressions have a hazy and imprecise meaning, and lesser degrees of clarity. For example, even the expression, the highest even number, has a meaning, since we know it would have to have the property of being divisible by 2, and we would therefore be able to distinguish it from the highest odd number, and we also have a vague instruction on how to generate it, in the sense that we can imagine counting higher and higher numbers, separating odd from even. Except that we realize we will never get there, as in a dream wherein we think we can grasp hold of something without ever managing to do so. But an expression like, a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere, doesn't suggest any rule for producing a corresponding object. Not only does it fail to support any definition, but it frustrates every effort to imagine one, apart from making us feel dizzy. An expression like absolute has a definition that is, all in all, tautological. A thing is absolute when it is not contingent, it is contingent when it is not absolute, but it does not suggest descriptions, definitions, and classifications. We cannot think of any instructions for producing anything corresponding to it, nor do we know any of its properties, except to suppose that it has everything, and it is probably what St. Anselm of Canterbury described as id cujus nihil magis cogitare possit. Something beyond which nothing greater can be thought. Which brings to mind the saying attributed to the pianist Arthur Rubinstein. Do I believe in God? No, what I believe in is something much greater. What we can imagine at most in trying to conceive of God is the classic night in which all cows are black. It is certainly possible not only to name but also to represent visually what we cannot conceive. But these images do not represent the unimaginable. They simply invite us to try to picture something unimaginable and then frustrate our expectation. What we experience in trying to understand them is that very sense of impotence expressed by Dante in the last canto of Paradise, number 33, lines 82 to 96, translated by Mark Musa, when he wants to describe to us what he saw at the moment when he fixed his gaze on the divinity, but all he can say is that he cannot tell us, and resorts to the intriguing metaphor of a book with an infinite number of pages. O grace abounding in allowing me to dare to fix my gaze on the eternal light. So deep my vision was consumed in it, I saw how it contains within its depths all things bound in a single book by love, of which creation is the scattered leaves. How substance, accident, and their relation were fused in such a way that what I now describe is but a glimmer of that light. I know I saw the universal form, the fusion of all things, for I can feel, while speaking now, my heart leap up in joy. One instant brings me more forgetfulness than 25 centuries brought the quest. That stunned Neptune when he saw Argo's keel. And the sense of impotence is no different when expressed by Leopardi seeking to describe infinity. My mind sinks in this immensity, and foundering is sweet in such a sea. Point 1. This is why it is artists who have come here, to this festival, to talk about the absolute. Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite wrote that, since the Divine One is so distant from us that he can be neither understood nor reached, he must be spoken of through metaphors and allusions, but above all, as an indication of the paucity of our language, through negative symbols, contrasting expressions. And they extol it also with names of the most remote things, sweet-smelling ointment, cornerstone, and they also clothe it in the form of a wild beast, attaching to it the characteristics of a lion and a panther, and saying that it will be like a leopard and an angry bear. Celestial Hierarchy, Chapter 2. Certain naive philosophers have suggested that poets alone can describe being or the absolute, but in fact they express only the indefinite. The poet Mallarmé spent his life trying to express an Orphic explanation of the earth. I say, a flower. And out of the oblivion where my voice relegates all context, insofar as something other than known calyxes is musically raised, an idea itself and gentle, the absence of all fragrance, cries de Vers, 1895. This passage, in truth, is untranslatable. It tells us only that a word is chosen, alone in the white space that surrounds it, and it inevitably unleashes the totality of the non-said, but in the form of an absence. In fact, to name an object, this means suppressing 3/4 of the enjoyment of the poem, which involves working it out little by little. To suggest, that is the dream, Sur l'évolution littéraire. Réponse Elenchi de Jules Huret, 1891. Mallarmé pursued this dream throughout his life, but it eluded him. Dante had taken such illusion for granted from the very beginning, well aware that it is diabolic pride to claim that infinity can be expressed in finite terms, and he had avoided this inadequacy of poetry by making poetry out of such an inadequacy. His is not poetry that seeks to say the unsayable, but rather poetry about the impossibility of saying it. It should be remembered that Dante was a believer, as were Pseudo-Dionysius and Nicholas of Cusa. Can you believe in an absolute and claim it is unimaginable and indefinable? Certainly, provided the impossible thought of the absolute is replaced by a feeling of the absolute and therefore by faith, as the substance of those hoped for things and argument for things we have not seen. Dante, Paradise, Canto 24, lines 64 to 65. Elie Wiesel, during this festival, recalled the words of Kafka, that it is possible to talk with God, but not about God. If the absolute is philosophically a night in which all cows are black, then for the mystic who, like John of the Cross, perceives it as a dark night, O night that guided me, O night more lovely than the dawn. It is a source of ineffable feeling. John of the Cross expresses his mystical experience through poetry. In the face of the indescribability of the absolute, we may feel reassured by the fact that this unsatisfied tension can be materially resolved in a finished form. This enabled Keats, in his Ode on a Grecian Urn, to see beauty as a substitute for the experience of the absolute. Beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. And that is fine for those who have decided to follow an aesthetic religion. But John of the Cross would have told us that it was only his mystical experience of the absolute that assured him of the only possible truth. This has led many men of faith to the conviction that those philosophers who reject the possibility of knowing the absolute are automatically rejecting every criterion of truth, or by rejecting such a thing as an absolute criterion of truth, they are rejecting the possibility of experiencing the absolute. But it is one thing to say that a philosophy rejects the possibility of knowing the absolute, and another thing to say that it rejects every criterion of truth, even that relating to the contingent world. Are truth and experience of the absolute then so inseparable? Confidence that something is true is fundamentally important for the survival of human beings. If we were unable to consider that what others tell us is either true or false, society would not be possible. We wouldn't even be able to exclude the possibility that a box with aspirin written on it didn't in fact contain strychnine. A specular theory of truth is that it is eta equatio rei et intellectus, as if our mind were a mirror that, provided it works properly and is not distorted or misted, must truly reflect things as they are. It is a theory supported, for example, by Thomas Aquinas, but also by Lenin in Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, 1909, and since Aquinas could not have been a Leninist, it ought to follow that Lenin was a neo-Thomist, without, of course, realizing it. In reality, other than in states of ecstasy, we are obliged to say what our mind reflects. Nevertheless, we define as true or false, not the things themselves but the assertions we make about how things are. Alfred Tarski's famous definition says that the statement, "snow is white," is true if, and only if, snow is white. Let us leave aside for the moment the whiteness of snow, which is more and more open to dispute, and consider another example. The statement, "it is raining," set between quotation marks, is true only if outside it is raining, without quotation marks. The first part of the definition, between quotation marks, is a verbal statement and represents nothing other than itself, but the second part should express how things in fact are. Nevertheless, something that ought to be a state of things is expressed once again in words. To avoid this linguistic mediation, we ought to say that, "it is raining," between quotation marks, is true if there is that thing there, and, without saying anything, we point to the rain that is falling. But although this way of indicating the evidence of the senses can be used with rain, it would be more difficult to do the same with the statement, "Earth revolves around the sun," since, if anything, the senses would tell us quite the opposite. To establish whether the statement corresponds to a particular set of circumstances, it is necessary to have interpreted the word rain and to have formed a definition of it. It needs to have been established that, A. To talk of rain, it is not enough to feel drops of water falling from above, as there could be someone watering flowers on a balcony above. B. The drops must be of a certain consistency, otherwise we would talk of mist or frost. C. The sensation must be continuous, otherwise we would say it was trying to rain but had come to nothing, and so forth. Having decided this, we have to pass on to an empirical test, which in the case of rain can be done by anyone. All we have to do is hold out our hand and trust our senses. But in the case of the statement, "Earth revolves around the sun," the ways for testing it are more complex. What meaning does the word true have for each of the following statements? I have a stomachache. Last night I dreamed that Mother Teresa appeared to me. Tomorrow it will certainly rain. The world will end in 2536. There is life after death. Statements 1 and 2 express a subjective fact, but the stomachache is a clear and irrepressible sensation, whereas when I recall a dream I had last night, I may not be sure the memory is accurate. What is more, the two statements cannot be directly verified by other people. A doctor would, of course, have certain ways of checking whether I actually have gastritis or whether I'm a hypochondriac, but a psychoanalyst would have more difficulty if someone tells him she has seen Mother Teresa in a dream, since she could easily be lying. Statements 3, 4, and 5 are not directly verifiable. But whether it will rain tomorrow can be verified tomorrow, whereas whether the world will end in 2536 is rather more of a problem. And here we distinguish between the reliability of a weather forecaster and that of a prophet. The difference between statements 4 and 5 is that 4 will become true or false in 2536, whereas 5 will continue to remain empirically undecidable per secula seculorum. Now let's consider these statements. 6. The sum of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees. 7. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. 8. The apple is an angiosperm. 9. Napoleon died on May 5, 1821. 10. We reach the coast following the path of the sun. 11. Jesus is the Son of God. 12. The correct interpretation of the Holy Scriptures is decided by the teachings of the Church. 13. An embryo is already a human being and has a soul. Some of these statements are true or false according to the rules we have stipulated. The sum of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees only in the context of a Euclidean system of postulates. That water boils at 100 degrees at standard atmospheric pressure, that is, at sea level, is true not only if we accept a law of physics elaborated through inductive generalization, but also on the basis of the definition of degrees centigrade. An apple is an angiosperm only on the basis of certain rules of botanical classification. Some require us to trust facts ascertained by others before us. We believe it is true that Napoleon died on May 5, 1821, because we accept what the history books tell us, but we must always recognize the possibility that an unpublished document discovered tomorrow in the British Naval Archives might show that he died on another date. Sometimes for utilitarian reasons we adopt an idea as true that we know to be false. For example, to find our way in the desert, we behave as if it were true that the sun moves from east to west. As for statements of a religious nature, we shall not say they are undecidable. If the evidence of the Gospels is accepted as historical, the proof of the divinity of Christ would be accepted as such by a Protestant. But this would not be so for the teachings of the Catholic Church. The statement regarding embryos having a soul depends entirely on stipulating the meanings of expressions such as life, human, and soul. Thomas Aquinas, for example, see the essay, No Embryos in Paradise, claimed that, like animals, they had only a sensitive soul and therefore were not yet human beings equipped with a rational soul, and would not participate in the resurrection of the flesh. Today he would be accused of heresy, but at that very civilized time they made him a saint. It is therefore a matter of deciding each time which criteria for truth we are using. It is on the very recognition of various degrees of verifiability or acceptability of a truth that our sense of tolerance is based. I may be obliged, from a scientific and educational point of view, to fail a student who claims that water boils at 90 degrees, like the right angle, as was apparently once suggested in an exam, but even a Christian ought to accept that for some people there is no other God than Allah and Muhammad as his prophet, as we likewise ask Muslims to do for Christians concerning Christian doctrine. And yet, in light of recent controversies, it seems that this distinction between different criteria of truth, typical of modern thought and in particular of logical scientific thought, produces a relativism that is seen as a historical malaise of contemporary culture, which rejects all idea of truth. But what do anti-relativists mean by relativism? Some encyclopedias of philosophy tell us there is a cognitive relativism, by which objects can be known only under conditions determined by human faculties. But in this sense Kant would also have been a relativist, and he certainly didn't reject the possibility of setting out laws of universal value, and what is more, he believed in God, if only on moral grounds. Yet in another philosophical encyclopedia we find that relativism means every idea that does not admit absolute principles in the field of knowledge and action. But it is a different matter to reject absolute principles in the sphere of knowledge or the sphere of action. There are people who are prepared to assert that the statement, pedophilia is evil, is a truth relative only to a particular system of values, seeing that it was or is accepted or tolerated in certain cultures, but who are nevertheless prepared to assert that the Pythagorean theorem must be valid for all times and all cultures. No one could seriously include Einstein's theory of relativity under the label of relativism. To say that a measurement depends on the conditions of movement of the observer is regarded as a valid principle for every human being in every time and place. Relativism, as a philosophical doctrine as such, came into existence with 19th-century positivism, together with the claim that the absolute is unknowable and, at most, is a movable limit of ongoing scientific research. But no positivist has ever claimed it is not possible to arrive at scientific truths that are objectively verifiable and valid for all. A philosophical position that, on a cursory reading of the textbooks, might be defined as relativistic is so-called holism, according to which every statement is true or false, and acquires a meaning only within an organic system of assumptions, a given conceptual scheme, or, as others have said, within a given scientific paradigm. A holist claims, rightly, that the notion of space has a different meaning in the Aristotelian system than it does in the Newtonian system, so that the two systems are incommensurable, and that one scientific system is as valid as the other to the extent to which it succeeds in explaining a series of phenomena. But the holists are the first to tell us there are systems that cannot actually explain a series of phenomena, and that some are far better because they succeed better than the others in doing so. Thus even the holist, in his apparent tolerance, has to deal with matters that require explanation and, even when he doesn't say so, follows what I would call a minimal realism, the belief that things exist or behave in a certain way. Perhaps we will never understand it, but if we don't believe it exists, our research would make no sense, and it would make no sense to go on trying out new systems to explain the world. The holist is usually said to be a pragmatist, but here again it is better not to be over hasty in reading the textbooks. The true pragmatist, such as Peirce, did not say that ideas are true only if they prove to be effective, but that they show their effectiveness when they are true. When he supported fallibilism, namely, the possibility that all of our ideas could always be revoked in case of doubt, at the same time he stated that through the continual correction of its knowledge the human community carries forward the torch of truth. What gives rise to a suspicion of relativism in these theories is the fact that the various systems are incommensurable. Certainly the Ptolemaic system is incommensurable with the Copernican system, and only in the first do the notions of epicycle and deferent assume a precise meaning. But the fact that the two systems are incommensurable does not mean they are not comparable, and it is precisely by comparing them that we understand what are the celestial phenomena that Ptolemy explained with the notions of epicycle and deferent, and we understand that they were the same phenomena that the Copernicans wanted to explain according to a different conceptual scheme. The holism of philosophers is similar to linguistic holism, wherein a given language, through its semantic and syntactic structure, is said to impose a particular vision of the world in which the speaker is, so to speak, a prisoner. Benjamin Lee Whorf, for example, pointed out that there is a tendency in Western languages to consider many events as objects, and an expression such as 3 days is grammatically equivalent to 3 apples, whereas some Native American languages focus on the process. They see events whereas we see things. For this reason, the Hopi language would be better equipped than English for defining certain phenomena studied by modern physics. And Whorf also pointed out that the Eskimos have 4 different words for snow, depending on its texture, and they would therefore see different things where we see only one. Leaving aside the fact that this suggestion has been disputed, a Western skier knows nevertheless how to distinguish between various textures of snow, and it would be quite enough for an Eskimo to meet us to understand perfectly well that when we say, snow, for the 4 things that he supposedly describes in different ways, we are behaving in the same way as a Frenchman who uses the word glacé for ice, glacier, ice cream, mirror, and window glass, and the Frenchman isn't such a prisoner of his own language that he shaves in the morning looking at himself in an ice cream. Finally, apart from the fact that not all contemporary thought accepts the holistic approach, holism follows the line of those perspective-based theories of knowledge according to which reality can be given different perspectives and each perspective matches one aspect of it, even if it doesn't exhaust its unfathomable richness. There is nothing relativistic in claiming that reality is always defined from a particular point of view, which does not mean subjective and individual, nor does the assertion that we see it always and only under a certain description stop us from believing and hoping that what we picture is always the same thing. Alongside cognitive relativism, the encyclopedias referred to cultural relativism. First Montaigne, then Locke, had begun to understand, at a time when Europe was coming into more significant contact with other peoples, that different cultures not only have different languages or mythologies but also different conceptions of morality, all reasonable in their own context. It seems indisputable that certain primitive people in the forests of New Guinea, even today, regard cannibalism as legitimate and commendable, while an Englishman would not, and it seems similarly indisputable that certain countries treat adulterous women in a manner different from ours. But, first, recognizing the variety of cultures does not mean denying that certain types of conduct are more universal, for example, a mother's love for her children, or the fact that people generally use the same facial expressions to express disgust or delight, and second, it does not automatically imply that this recognition is tantamount to moral relativism, the idea that since there are no ethical values valid for all cultures, we can freely adapt our behavior to fit our personal tastes or interests. Recognizing that another culture is different, and must be respected in this, does not mean abdicating our own cultural identity. How then has the specter of relativism come to be built up as a standard ideology, the canker of contemporary civilization? There is a secular critique of relativism, directed mainly against the excesses of cultural relativism. Marcello Pera, who presents his arguments in a book titled Senza Radici, Without Roots, 2004, written jointly with the then Cardinal Ratzinger, is well aware that there are differences between cultures, but claims there are certain values of Western culture, such as democracy, the separation between church and state, and liberalism, that have proved superior to those of other cultures. Now, Western culture has good reason to regard itself as more developed than others in terms of these ideas, but in claiming that such superiority ought to be universally evident, Pera uses a dubious argument. He says, if members of culture B freely show they prefer culture A and not vice versa, if, for example, there is a migrant influx from Islamic countries to the West and not vice versa, then it is reasonable to believe that A is better than B. The argument is weak when we recall that the Irish in the 19th century did not immigrate en masse to the United States because they preferred that Protestant country to their beloved Catholic Ireland, but because at home they were dying of starvation as a result of potato blight. Pera's rejection of cultural relativism is dictated by the concern that tolerance for other cultures degenerates into acquiescence, and that the West